Alright, so my name's Tim. I'll be talking to you about AngularJS. So, since there's familiarity, bear with me while I go over some of the basics. It's a JavaScript framework. It's open source. You can view all the source code, and I have many times right there on GitHub. The tagline that Google gives it is HTML enhanced for web apps. We'll talk more about what that really means. Someone tagged the term MVW for model view whatever. You can do MVVM with Angular if you want. You can do MVC with Angular if you want. So it's model view, whatever works for you. And it is one among many. I don't know if you've heard of any of these others, but there's a plethora of JavaScript frameworks out there right now. And these are just some that I've come across. In my opinion, it's the best, but that's to be debated. So why do we need something like this? And the answer is we've gone from this to this over the past number of years. And the biggest differences here are that then we used to have, back in the day we had static, monolithic web pages. It was just, they were documents. You opened a page up, you read it, you moved on to the next document, you clicked a link and it took your browser to a whole new page, and that was about the extent of it. And then Ajax came along, and now we've got these dynamic web apps. They truly are apps in your browser. A lot of HTTP calls going in and out, and it's not the browser whole page that's refreshing in a lot of cases. It's just picking up new information, bringing it in, and putting it right where it needs to be in the page. SPA stands for single page app, single page web app, and that's a lot of people's goal. Is you land on one page, and then the entire life cycle of the application, like Gmail, it all happens within one page. And here's a graphic that explains another person I found's feelings about AngularJS over time. And when I first came across this, I couldn't believe how accurate it was to my own experience. So perhaps it'll be yours as well. Throughout the course of today, we might get to the second bump. I don't know, we'll see. Let's hope we don't end on a low spot. Here's our Angular Hello World application. And this is, if you haven't noticed, this presentation is actually happening in Chrome. And what you're seeing in that string of text, hello world, is an actual running Angular application. And the code that you see in the box there is what produces that. So what? We see a couple weird things if you're familiar with HTML. You'll see a couple things that aren't instantly recognizable. This ng-app attribute and this ng-init attribute and this curly bracket mustache template syntax that you see there in the header. Those are all provided by and have meaning in the Angular framework. So we see some templating. I'm going to say we see expressions. I'll explain more about what those are. Name equals world is an expression, and then just name in the mustache template syntax there is an expression, an Angular expression. And we're seeing data binding. We talked about two-way data binding with MVVM, and Angular provides the same thing. So we're referencing a property called name in that template there, hello name. If the property name were to change, it would be instantly updated in there. We don't see that in the static example, but there is data binding. So the very starting point of any Angular application, either implicitly or explicitly, is a module. And all Angular code lives within modules. So here's an example of a simple module. And you see the syntax. You've got this Angular global, and it's got a method called module, which allows you to declare a module. And the syntax is you give it a name, and then you give it an array of strings which represent other modules that your module depends on. So Angular is very heavy on modularization and giving you places to put your code, and it can contain things, and that aids reusability and code clarity. And it's really fantastic. It's kind of like the separation concerns that we saw with MVVM. Modules is just another layer of breaking things apart. And then you define all your code belongs to various properties of a module. In this case, I'm defining a controller on a module, and I'm defining a service on a module, assuming that those are defined elsewhere. And I've got a little demo here. So this is a static example, not a lot going on, but this is the source code for it. No, thank you. This is the extent of our HTML that makes up this page. Again, we see NGApp on our HTML element. That says, once Angular is done loading, look for a module named app and bootstrap it as the application, or rather, that module is going to be connected to this portion of HTML. And the HTML is the root element, so that module has control, effectively, of the entire page. That's typically how you set up. If you're doing an SPA, a single page app with Angular, you'll always see this NGApp defined on the HTML element, and that's just a way to say, this is your starting point. Start with this module named app and go from there. And then the only other thing of interest in here is down here on the body element, we see this ng controller, and that's what specifies what controller is in control of all the elements underneath that body element. So we've defined over here in our JavaScript file a controller called main controller. We've defined a property on the main controller item with a name and a point value. And if we take a look back over at the HTML, we've got this paragraph which consists of main.item. We've given an alias to our controller here in this ng controller attribute, and so we can reference anything. Okay. We can reference it in our templating syntax there. Does everybody get that? Follow, see where things are coming from, where they're going to? Yeah, pretty simple. What an alias really does behind the scenes is whenever you have a controller and you connect it to a part of the DOM, like we've connected the main controller to the body, it creates what's called a scope. A scope object is just a place. It's like the glue between your controller and your view. And when you give it an alias, you implicitly create a property on your scope by the name of that alias. Okay. So let's take a look at, we're using this keyword to define the property item directly on our controller object. So what we've done with that main controller as main is created a property on the scope called main, and it is equal to the controller itself. Okay. So that's another way of referencing it. Cool. The alternative is to take control of the scope, and in fact this is how used to be how you had to do it before they introduced this alias syntax, is you have to inject the scope into your controller and then define things on the scope directly. And then at one point someone just kind of came up with the idea of kind of shortcutting a couple of steps. I may talk more about that down the line, the scope, because it is an integral part of Angular, but I didn't want to jump into it right away. So yeah, there's no main function. Angular has a completely declarative syntax. You don't say, you don't have public int void main or whatever as your starting point. You just start with a module. And modularization is great. We talked a little bit about controllers. Here's another simple example of a controller. By convention, you give them what's called Pascal case names, whereas everything else is going to be camel case. But for whatever reason, the convention is you typically Pascal case and end it with the name with the word controller on it, just for clarity, I guess. And then inside the controller, like we were seeing in the model view model, you put logic and business logic in the view model, or yeah, because you don't have a controller, it kind of takes the place of a controller. This is where behavior belongs, not data, although I'm kind of cheating here and putting data in there. Typically, you'd have something like a service which would give you access to a backend, like a database or something. And so you wouldn't put data in here, but I bootstrapped a lot of these examples by just putting some data in there. So now we're going to see a little interactivity. I've got this button add, which allows me to add things to this list, and they show up here in the page. I've got a very simple HTML page here, and all we're doing is showing the contents of main.items, just the items on the main controller. This is called a filter, which just says show it with the JSON syntax. And so on my controller, items is this array. We start with this array, and then we've got this add item function, which pushes an item on the array of the next count and increments the count at the same time. So here's the items, here's the button, which performs that function, add item function. We all see that? Pretty simple so far. So controllers should be short. There's other places to put logic. We'll talk more about that. And they're injectable. And I will talk more about that in a minute. Is anybody familiar with the term dependency injection? Good. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about that before we're done. Now things are going to be a little bit more interesting. And this is, if you look for an Angular tutorial online, this will be something like what you'll find. There's a little more interactivity going on. And this just shows two-way data binding. So I've got this slider here that's bound to a count property. And you can see as I slide it in real time, our template up here updates to represent the new count. I've got a hello Tim string up there, so if I change it to hello Timmy, hello Benson, I can put a message in here, and if I click say the message, it pops up. I don't know if you can see that. Message is in that alert box there. So what's the code that does this look like? Hopefully we're getting an idea of what this might look like. Starting with our controller, we define an object on the controller called person with a name. We define a property on the controller called count, and we define a function called say. And all it does is alert, use the built-in alert method to make that window pop up. And the HTML, there we go. Again, we give body, or we give the magic controller control of the body. And so within here we can reference it. We can reference the person.name. We can reference the count in our templates here. And now we have these input elements, and there's this new attribute NGModel. Okay, so NGModel is what does all this magic. It's what enables two-way data binding. So it attaches behavior to this input to say, okay, whenever your value changes, set it to this property, magic.person.name. And that's there's nothing else that's required to get this two-way data binding. Again, on this input, we put it to magic.count, and we already saw this ngClick attribute on the button before. Again, this does the same thing, but to note here is that this input box references a name, a property on the scope called message. Okay, so it's not on the controller, so we're not using the magic alias there. So it's kind of a throwaway value. It's just, it kind of exists. It exists on the scope, which is accessible by the controller if you want to get to it, but we don't need to put it on the scope because we don't need to put it on the controller. I'm not using it on the controller. We're just using it to turn around and call the say method with that property. Any questions about that? Am I sufficiently confusing you guys? Do you feel like you're following along all right? Okay. All right, so NGModel is a beautiful thing. It's what gives you two-way data binding. It also does other cool stuff like form validation, and implicitly it does formatting and parsing. So in reality, anything that is visible on the page in an HTML page is just a string. So if you've got a model which has a date or has a number or whatever it may be, there's got to be some process of converting that to a string representation to get it to show on the view. That just has to happen. So NGModel does that for you. You can control how it does that, but it has behavior defined for all the built-in properties you would expect to come across, all the built-in types. So it can show a date and all that stuff. But inside the NGModel is where that happens. Let's talk about templating for a second. And I'm talking about templating in a little bit of a different context than what I was saying before. We have that mustache curly brace syntax that we saw where you can plop a name in your view just by putting it in those delimiters. So that's one form of templating, but I'm going to talk about a different kind of templating here. So on this example, we have a list of people, and right now there's only one person in the list. So there's a couple things happening here. You see just that one person in the list, and you see this string that says you're lonely. If I were to add another person to the list here, they show up in the list immediately, and this string changed from "you're lonely" to "two's company." And make up some bad names here. Three's a crowd. Okay, so we're getting a feel for how this works. This person's only 8 years old. So there's a good bit going on here. Let's take a look at the source. We don't need this. Okay, same setup here. Body with the one controller on the body. Now we have an unordered list defined right here. And on this li, this list item tag, we have an ngRepeat attribute defined. And this expression in here says, for each person in main.people. So this is a repeater. This ngRepeat is going to take this li item and it's going to magically sort of duplicate it for each item that it finds in that collection, the main.people collection. And you can see this, the template within that list item is just to show the first name, the last name, and to show the date of birth, kind of full years since the person's date of birth, because that's what we're showing is their age. And it only shows this span if that person has a date of birth. So there's also this ngIf. And so we've seen a ton of these ng attributes. Ng just stands for Angular. It's all of their built-in directives, they're called. And it comes with a whole slew of them to do pretty much anything you can think of. But one really neat thing about Angular is it's completely extensible. So you can, and often do, if you start programming with Angular, is you start creating your own directives, your own ngIf, your own ngRepeat. You know, those are very complicated things, and I'm thankful that Angular maintains those. But if you want to do something that Angular doesn't quite do for you, you can create your own directive, and we're going to see an example of that later on as well. So we see ngRepeat, we see ngIf. Basically put the span in here if this attribute in here is true, otherwise if it's false, don't put it in there. And then down here we have this ngSwitch, and it switches on the length property of the people array. And so if there's 1 in here, it shows you're lonely. If there's 2, two's company, so on and so forth. If we were to add another person, it'd say too many people. And now we have a form down below. This is where we got the first name form, last name, date of birth. And we see this hint, please enter a first name, which goes away as soon as you enter a first name. This is where I was talking about NGModel allowing you to do form validation. It's just very simple. All I've said is that on the input element for first name, it's required. So that required is actually, that's a standard HTML attribute, but Angular also knows how to take it and to do some extra stuff to it. Basically augment this NGModel to say, hey, this field is required. And then your form has this property of being valid or invalid, and it updates on the fly as you type things, as you erase things. If I were to erase this, go back to an invalid state, then we can see this, please enter a first name. And we say, the form first name field, there's an error, $error property or object on there which has a required property set to true if there's an error on that field. So very declarative syntax. It just takes a little getting used to, but once you got a feel for it, everything's straightforward. There's not a lot of confusing ins and outs of this. It's pretty declarative and straightforward. Last name and date of birth have no validation on them. And and my button is disabled if the form is not valid. So I can't add a person until I give it what I've told it requires. Now let's talk a little bit about filters. We saw filters before. We saw a JSON filter initially. I think I showed you, I might not have showed you any filters, but filters are really sweet. Here's an example of 3 different filters, and I'll just show you what this does. As I type in this field up here, it filters my list. So I can search this rather short list by name. And you can see as you type, it filters on the fly. Everything's very responsive, very dynamic. And I can also order these fields by clicking on them. I want to see ordered ascending or descending by worth, date of birth, whatever. And additionally, this date of birth is formatted nicely in the view. I can control that through a filter, how that date of birth is displayed. Do I want to show the minutes and seconds and hours too, or just the date, or however you want to show it? And this worth is actually formatted using the currency filter. So depending on locale, you can tell it how currency should be displayed. So we're displaying U.S. currency. It filters it to show 2 decimal places, regardless of whether or not, if this were .20, it would still show .20 because that's how we expect currency to look. And it puts the $sign in front. Pretty much all of this is happening in our view here. A little styling for my table. But I've got click handlers attached to these headers. And all it does is set this property called order to either be name in the case of this first header, or minus name if the property is already name. And that's how we get this ordering. Down below in our table body, we've got table rows which are repeated for each person in the people list. And there's this pipe syntax in our expression. That's where you see a filter coming into play. So that says filter this collection by the order by filter. And order by filter takes a parameter. So we got the colon, and we pass it in order. So that's where we tell it what to order by. Order these objects by their name, or order these objects by their date of birth or worth or whatever. And additionally, filter the list. So filter it by an object with a name property means filter them by name according to whatever the value of search is. And that's defined in my input box up here with the NGModel. So again, a lot going on, but I haven't written very much code at all. In fact, my controller does nothing except define my data, which it wouldn't typically. So it's all in the view here. I've gotten this powerful interface just by attaching a few attributes to my HTML. So you get to see the expressive power coming into play here of Angular. Questions about this one? Cool. Routing. And routing, okay, so routing comes into play when you are building single-page apps. The browser has this powerful concept of the URL, and people are accustomed to the URL changing when you go to a different part of your application. But with a single-page app, we already said that the browser doesn't go and fetch a whole new page and come back. There's not that whole round-trip deal. It's more like you're staying on one page, really, and you're going to fetch a new data or a new chunk of HTML to inject here and go and fetch some data to populate that. So Angular provides some built-in tools to do routing. Now if we take a look at the URL bar, in this example, we can see that I'm at /home. Okay, so I'm just using this hash syntax. Angular does let you do this without the hash, but there's some caveats to that I won't get into right now. But suffice to say, at this point, we're using this hash syntax mode of routing. Okay, so I'm at root home, and what I see is this page right here. And I can click on the about, and now I'm at /about, and I see the about portion of the page here. So this top part is a header, and then this part down here reloads depending on where you're at in your application. Additionally, on home, there's a list of these items, and I can click on an item and go to a route called /thing/1, 1 being presumably the ID or some identifier for this magic wand property here. And I can go to, I've got a few on here, so you can see that you can either get to it by a link, or you can just type it in your URL bar directly and get to these things. So you can get different routes loading different parts of HTML in your page, where you define, and they can be parameterized. So they can be parameterized by any number of things in the URL here. Let's take a brief look at the code that put this all together. I no longer have a controller Okay, so I do have controllers defined, but they're attached by the router, not explicitly by me to any part of the DOM. So my body can just consists of this header. It's got the two links for home and about. And then I have this ngView attribute down here. And that's this div, if we were to inspect this. Yeah, so you can see that this div is just everything that the proper view is loaded into according to what route you're at. And everything interesting is happening in this in my module. You have a config block, which allows you to set some configuration in your module. And I'm passing in the route provider and the location provider, which are a couple Angular services, which let you take control of this routing thing. So I'm saying, okay, route provider, when I'm at /home, load this chunk of HTML, attach to it this controller, and it's going to say, okay, I'll go do that, connect it all up, and I'll stick it right in that ngView that we saw in the HTML page. When you're at a /about, this one's a little simpler. It's just HTML. There's no controller with that one. Just go get that HTML and plop it in the ngView. Same thing with this route definition, the thing route. It's /thing ID, and we go and get this HTML. We attach it to the thing controller. I got a little fancy. Probably too much. Okay, resolve is a property on a route which lets you do some things before going to that route. So if I type in here, go to thing/1, it says, okay, but in order to resolve to that route, I need to get a thing, and then I can go to the route. That's what resolve does. We don't need to delve into the details of resolve. It's more like an advanced topic in Angular, but it's very powerful. Typically what you'll do at that point is reach out to a database or the back end or something. So you might be waiting a second or two before you have your object to get to the route. So Angular just basically allows you to say, okay, I'm trying to get to this page. Before I get there, I need to go fetch some data. And when I'm done, then you can proceed routing to that page. We're seeing these functions all over the place, and they've got all these parameters. And I mentioned it before, but those are that's dependency injection at play. That's saying I'm asking for a thing called $timeout, a thing called $route, and a thing called thing service. And Angular says, well, I know what those are, so when you need them, I'll give them to you. I'll inject them, those things that you depend on, I'll inject them into this function. And it does that by looking at the actual name of the parameter, not positional or anything. It just says, oh, you're looking for a $timeout, so I'll give it to you. In fact, I'm not even using that here, but I was at one time. And otherwise, go home. So if I try to go to anything other than what I have defined, it says, nope, you're going to home. Yeah, anybody want to look at anything else about this, ask questions about this one? Yeah?
Does this get really, really bulky when you have like a bigger web application?
The question is, does this get bulky when you have a bigger application? I was talking about modularization from the get-go. And so far I've only showed you examples where you've just got one main JavaScript file and everything's kind of dumped in there. You won't do that. If you're building a big Angular app, you'll have many different files. They'll be in a nested hierarchy. They're going to be structured. You might have different modules within your application. So I built an Angular app that I just said, okay, for each portion of the page, I'm going to create a new module, and I'm just going to try that out. And I had one module that was like shared code across the whole app, and everything went in there that was shared. So there are techniques for breaking things apart so that it's not just one big dumping ground. Yeah. And Angular gives you actually a lot of facilities to do that, which is nice. Yeah?
Is the resolve portion of this also breaking the typical model view controller, where now you has to go get data from the database?
I don't think so. The question is the resolve part of that route definition breaking the MVC pattern? Honestly, when it comes to Angular, nobody's going in thinking, I got to follow this pattern, I got to follow this pattern. It's just, I got to do this the Angular way. And it allows you to do MVC, but it's not going to strictly follow those patterns in all cases. But I don't think it is. We were kind of looking at controller code, in this case kind of back-end logic. And you know, I don't know what category to put that in, but it's not like we're putting data in the view. That's the biggest thing with Angular is let your view be data agnostic. I mean, you have to know what the structure is, but don't say this text box has this text in it. You know, templatize things, separate your view from your data, and then the whatever is there's just a lot of flexibility in between, because Angular doesn't really enforce a lot on you in terms of you can just use JavaScript data and just use, you know, whatever JavaScript you're familiar with or comfortable with to write everything in between. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, go back to my presentation here. Dependency injection. Dependency injection is a beautiful thing. It's probably the coolest concept I encountered after Grove City in the field of computer science. So I get really excited about it. And Angular is all about dependency injection. So we've seen kind of like what it is, what it lets you do. We've seen it where it happens, all those functions where these parameters just get passed in magically for you. So it's all about decoupling. It's all about decoupling things. So when you define a component of your application, it might be, I mean, it could be a controller that controls one part of your page. It could be a service which is going to connect to a backend to go and fetch data for you from, you know, from a backend server somewhere or something like that. Angular wants you to be able to write these things in a way that's decoupled. So you don't have URLs embedded in your service. You might have something which provides a URL. And so when you write your service, you just say, hey, I need a URL to connect to. Angular, what is it? Inject it for me. And then so what that would allow you to do perhaps is move your application from one environment to another environment. And all you need to do is switch this one URL parameter, and all of a sudden you're connecting to a new backend. You don't have to search and replace through your whole code base to find all instances of that URL and change them all to the new one. Similarly, at a higher level, if you've got an application that uses a backend, a service to talk to a real backend, like go and fetch data from your database, might not be ideal in testing to have to actually make those calls and wait on the database or manipulate real data. You might want to just put in a mock service. So what you can do is your controller might use that service, for example, and say, oh, okay, I know I need to get some data, but it doesn't really care where it comes from. And you've got a service which is in control of getting the data. You could inject a different service at runtime if you wanted to do testing. And instead of actually making the calls to the back end, you could just say, well, send this data. You just kind of mock it together. It's really ideal for testing. In Angular, anyway, and this is not an Angular-specific concept. This is just, in computer science, there's a concept called dependency injection, and it's wonderful. Here's a simple example of what it looks like in Angular. If I've got a module, and I've called it app in this instance, I can create a service called myService, which is going to use an HTTP service in turn to get some stuff. So myService has a function called getStuff, and it goes and gets some URL to get some data back. In my controller, when I define it, I just say, okay, it takes $, scope. Anytime you see $, anything, it's an Angular built-in. Again, there are a lot of NG attributes are Angular built-ins, and $, whatevers are Angular built-ins. That's how they denote their stuff. But I can also get my service in my controller now. I haven't hard-coded what it is or anything. All I've said is, hey, Angular, I want something called my service. Give it to me, and Angular is in charge of giving it to you. Point being, you can reconfigure Angular then to tell it, well, what is that? In this instance, it's this service, but if I wanted to mock it out and give it a fake service to get fake data for testing purposes or something like that, then I could do that. And this controller would be none the wiser, and it doesn't need to be changed in any way. The last piece I want to talk about Angular is directives. And I've mentioned this before. I want to show you an example of what they might let you do. So here we have the neatly formatted, I was calling them contact cards for each person in my list of people. This is where code reusability really comes into play. If you find yourself repeating something from place to place to place, then often you want to put it somewhere, one place, where you can reuse it. So don't repeat yourself is the principle at play. The other thing is directives are what Angular gives you to interact with the DOM. And that's what all the directives that we've seen already, the ng repeat. It says, oh, okay, well, I got to take this chunk of DOM and I need to repeat it for each item in the list. Things like that. Anytime you want to interact with the DOM, you do it through directives. So directives can attach behavior, or they can alter the DOM, or anything related to the DOM. If you want to listen to a click event, that ng click that we saw, which says do something when you click on this, that's actually a directive. And Angular looks for a directive definition and says, oh, okay, kind of give this behavior to this element at runtime. It's also good for creating components, which is what I'm doing in this case. So let's take a look at the source code for this. My HTML is just bare bones simple. I've got my body, and in here I have this element, this custom element called TW contact card, which is repeated for each person in the people list, and it's ordered by their last name and their first name. And I pass into the contact card the person, which is right here, the person from each person in the list. Okay, so what is TW contact card, and where does that come from, and why does my browser all of a sudden know how to show something called TW contact card? Well, what Angular has done is I've created this directive called TW contact card, and you'll notice that this doesn't have the dashes in it. What you do whenever you're talking about a directive in JavaScript is you use camel case, but you can't use, or you don't by convention, use camel case in HTML. You use dash delimited syntax or case, so it kind of automatically normalizes it for you. Anyway, so I've defined it here, and all it is a template. I say go and fetch the HTML at this URL location, and I've defined a scope on my directive. So I've created this new component, and it's got its own scope. It lives in its own world. It's not directly connected to its parent scope or context. It's got its own place. So that's where code reuse comes into play, because you can drop this in anywhere. You don't have to worry about it mucking with everything else that's already there. So I could give this to somebody else with a completely different Angular application. They could drop it in there, and all they have to know is I've got to provide a person attribute to this, and it's going to be bound to, within the directive, an element called person. So let's see the definition of the directive. Not sure how to actually look at it. Contact card.html. There it is. It's just a div with a class. That's how I apply some styling to it. It's got a header where you see, so you're starting to see, now this is the definition of what this thing actually looks like. It's got their last name, comma, first name. Show this chunk if they have an address. Show this chunk if they have a phone. What type of phone is it? Is it a home phone? And it formats it for you and everything. And so this directive definition has allowed me to take this HTML, bundle it up into this thing called TW contact card, and now I can use that in my page rather than all the details of this don't need to be embedded directly in my index.html. I can just reference them there. And if I wanted to extract this from this project and use it in another project, I just need to copy that directive definition and away you go.